Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in London for high-stakes talks with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and European leaders days after his tense White House meeting with President Trump that sent shockwaves globally. Now, as the US signals a shift away from military support, Europe faces mounting pressure to step up. Now, what advice will Zelenskyy receive today, and what outcomes can we expect from the summit in the United Kingdom? Well, that's what we're about to discuss with my guest, Scott Lucas, professor at the University College of Dublin. Professor, so good to have you here with us this morning on TVP World.
Thank you so much.
Professor, so let's start with the big picture here. Now, how significant is Keir Starmer's show of support for Zelenskyy at this critical moment, especially in the wake of this chaotic clash that Zelenskyy had with Trump at the White House just a few days ago?
Well, I don't think it's just the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer show of support. I think it has to be the show of support from national leaders across Europe, including Poland, and throughout the world. Within moments of that attempted humiliation by Donald Trump and J.D. Vance of Volodymyr Zelenskyy on Friday, and probably the clear indication that the Trump administration will not provide assistance to Ukraine as it resists Russia's invasion, you had more than 20 leaders who took to social media or made statements to say, we stand with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, we stand with the Ukrainian people. Zelenskyy thanked each and every one of those folks, by the way, on social media. So I think what you saw in London on Saturday was a culmination of that, as those crowds cheered Zelenskyy outside 10 Downing Street. But of course, what's going to be important today is it's not just enough to have nice words to support Zelenskyy in Ukraine. You have to have plans and commitments. And the reality is that with U.S. economic and military aid probably disappearing from April or May, Europe and other countries will have to try to fill some of that gap.
Professor, so the United Kingdom announced that they have signed a loan agreement worth £2.26 billion. Where is that money going to go exactly?
Well, Ukrainian officials say that will go specifically to defense requirements. And of course, you're talking about, the ongoing need for air defense against Russia's daily missile and drone attacks. You're talking about the need for support equipment, not just equipment that is being used on the front line. But there was an even larger commitment made by Italy on Friday to provide billions of euros to energy infrastructure in Ukraine. And I think you'll see other commitments from European countries today, which will be both military aid and also that non-military aid to make sure that services continue to function, to make sure that energy continues to be delivered, despite Vladimir Putin's attempt to crush Ukraine's daily life.
Mm-hmm. Professor, I do have here that reportedly that loan would be repaid from the proceeds of frozen Russian assets. Can you clarify what that means exactly? Which frozen Russian assets are we talking about here?
Well, within Europe, we're talking at around, at least 200 billion euros. Some estimates run up into near 300 billion euros of Russian assets that have been held because of the invasion. There has been a protracted debate over whether Ukraine can use all of those assets, and where the agreement has landed is that you give Ukraine loans set against profits, the interest that you would accrue from holding those assets. So in a way, what you're doing is that you have that fundamental Russian assets, that fundamental 200, 300 billion euros, that doesn't diminish. But as you get profit from this, then that goes back into Ukraine for its defense and for other needs.
Professor, Keir Starmer has positioned himself as this bridge between Europe and the United States on Ukraine. But now, given Trump's reluctance, you said it as well, right? To provide military backing, do you think that the United Kingdom now could be effective in actually influencing Washington's stance?
Well, I think certainly Starmer and other European leaders are keeping the door open. That, we hope that adults in the room in Washington can try to persuade Trump, who can be persuaded. He has, if you appeal to his ego, to try to move back towards supporting Ukraine rather than siding with Vladimir Putin. But I think what happened on Friday was a very cold dose of reality as to why that may not be possible. And let me remind you just of the connections here. Emmanuel Macron had been in Washington on Monday. Keir Starmer had been in Washington on Thursday. Those trips were connected to Zelensky's trip because the initiative was to get an American backstop, air power, to protect the deployment of British, French, maybe troops from other NATO countries in Western Ukraine, to protect energy infrastructure, to protect facilities such as drone manufacturing plants, to bolster air defenses. And that was simply not just a public humiliation, it was an ambush of Zelensky.
Let me just ask you this. Do you think, you just said that Macron was there. Do you think that this kind of, whatever took place on Friday, do you think that it could have been predicted? That scenario such as what took place could have actually happened?
You hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And I think if you watch Zelensky in the run-up, even before that explosion happened, he knew from what not just Trump was saying, but J.D. Vance was saying, that they were not going to engage on the issue of assistance for Ukraine, and that they were going to put the priority on the direct talks with Russia.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about this summit for a moment here. It is to take place later today. What can we expect from it? What's on top of the agenda?
Well, I think as we talked about to start this interview, what you have to have is, there'll be the symbolic support for Ukraine, but you really have to show not just simply the commitments of funds, the commitments of equipment. You now have to show coordinated planning. Now, the EU has done this throughout this crisis. Remember that Europe has provided more assistance than the U.S. has, if you talk about military and non-military aid combined. But now you have got to deliver that assistance. You've got to work with Ukraine to get it in there, and you can't necessarily count on being able to work with U.S. officials. And remember, this is not just a case of Washington stepping aside. You're talking about, for example, that you have been able to work with U.S. officials within NATO to try to support Ukraine. That may not be possible given not just Trump and Vance standing against aid to Ukraine, but their attempts to effectively crush U.S. agencies, including the Pentagon.
Professor, but now with the U.S. stepping back, do you think that Europe is ready to take on this role? What challenges does the EU face? Is this something that's going to be discussed possibly today?
I think most of Europe has been building to this moment. Of course, I'll lead aside outliers like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who, of course, is effectively a supporter of Putin, Slovakia's Robert Fico. I think the rest of the European leaders knew that this was going to be a marathon, not a sprint. That if you were going to support Ukraine, it was going to be a case of years. I think they hoped they wouldn't have to face it without the United States. But yes, I think discussions have been going on for months because, look, we realized that Donald Trump was Vladimir Putin's last hope. He hadn't been able to overrun Kyiv. He hadn't been able to break Kyiv by depriving it of food, depriving it of energy. Russia has its own challenges in waging this war for a fourth year, full-scale war for a fourth year. And Trump was their sort of get-out-of-prison card. I think the question is now that Europe knows this is coming, and as I said, do you have the capabilities? Do you have the capabilities to provide artillery shells, to provide especially air power? And air power is needed here. And do you have support from your publics who will have to make sacrifices to help the Ukrainian people? Can you rally that type of opinion at what is the most important, I think, moment for the world since 1945?
Professor, Zelensky's visit is also going to reportedly include a meeting with King Charles III. What message is this going to send? What details can you give us on that?
I think the announcement by King Charles that he'll receive him at the palace in Sandringham is an important symbolic move for a couple of reasons. First of all, just simply to meet the king. I'm not a big fan of British royalty, but I've got to say, for many people, it is still the marker of what the United Kingdom is. So it's important that Zelensky gets that reception. And I think the second thing here is it's a signal to Donald Trump, because remember, as part of the attempt to get Trump to provide aid to Ukraine, Starmer wooed him with that invitation that he handed to him from King Charles for a state visit. So this sort of balances this. It's sort of a signal to Trump, which is, look, we're also going to support the guy that you tried to cut down. And the UK is not going to directly confront Trump. They're not going to say you're horrible, but they're going to send signals out to him that what he did on Friday simply was unacceptable.
Professor, do you think they're going to be able to restore ties? And if so, how is it going to play out? How do you predict this will unfold?
In terms of the ties, I have to say this with regret because, I was born and raised in the United States. I think you're talking about a threat to American democracy, the American system right now, even before you talk about ties. And I think you have to acknowledge that this Trump administration means that for the first time since 1941, when Poland was fighting for its survival, when the UK was fighting for its survival, when Europe was fighting for its survival, for the first time since 1941, there is no alliance. There's no alliance with these people in Washington. And that means that the ties you're talking about, Europe has to pull together. Europe has to work with Canada, who will be at that visit today. They'll have to work with countries in Asia. They'll have to work with countries in Latin America and Africa. This is a moment when Europe, after so many years and so many times when it has followed the United States, Europe and others have to come together, not for anyone to lead and others to follow, but for a genuine effort for Ukrainian security, European security, and the security of the world.
Thank you so much, Scott Lucas, professor at University College of Dublin, for being with us here this morning on World Talks and for all your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that completes this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.